As we've just heard, Germany is the first country in the European Union to declare that the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions Movement, or BDS, is anti-Semitic. This is a major declaration coming from the Bundestag, but will other countries follow suit? And more importantly, will this declaration have any impact on minimizing the rising trend of anti-Semitism prevalent in Europe today? Here with us to discuss is a panel of guests: former ambassador to Poland, Zvi Ravner, senior fellow at the Menachem Heritage Center, Paul Gross, and Dr. Natan Aridan of the Ben Gurion Research Institute for the Study of Israel and Zionism. Welcome. So let's jump right in. What does this declaration actually mean for BDS in Germany? We'll start with you.
Well, I mean, it's a recommendation for essentially recommending that BDS is not pursued in Germany. It doesn't ban it outright, but it is supported by the coalition and the two main opposition parties. So it's hugely significant in that regard, and it's the first such resolution by a European government. So I think it's certainly extremely significant. The question is whether it will change day-to-day life in Germany is questionable.
Mm-hmm. Now, can you tell us more about the move that led up to this vote?
Well, I have to say that to me it was quite surprising because I've been dealing quite a lot with Eastern Europe, where the BDS is quite an unusual phenomenon, and Germany is one of the countries where BDS was quite a strong movement. Actually, there were all sorts of developments in internal political developments that led apparently to a very abrupt and immediate and surprising move, and very positive, I have to say. I'm not sure that anyone here in the government was expecting it to come. So even though it's just as symbolic, actually, with one practical implication, and that is that no budget, no government funds will be available to those movements, this movement. But it's mainly very symbolic, and I think, in my view, more than to Germany itself, to the rest of Europe and to the BDS movement as a whole.
Is this the beginning of the end for the BDS movement, do you think?
Not at all, I think, unfortunately. The question is, what is the aim of the BDS? And we need to see this, by the way, in the perspective that in the United States, there has been legislation or various resolutions passed on the question of BDS. And as before mentioned, it's not legally binding. It is an important statement, but we need to understand the perspective. And that is that the BDS needs to be understood that since 1948, there have been the Arab boycotts of Israel with boycott officers, and had nothing to do with the West Bank, because the West Bank was not part, or the Golan or East Jerusalem, part of the State of Israel. This delegitimization, and the last thing I want to mention is, I don't want to get into whether it's anti-Semitism or not, but I've never met anyone who's very heavily involved in the BDS that even recognizes the State of Israel as a legitimate state within the 1949 Armistice Agreement borders. So it's not just a matter of the West Bank, it's a matter of the legitimacy of Israel's right to exist.
Yes.
Yeah, if I can just say one more thing about Germany specifically, I think it's not, in a certain respect, boycotts specifically have historical echoes for Germany because of the boycott of Jewish goods during the Nazi period.
Something that the resolution specifically voted out.
Right, and I think that's
out.
right.
Yeah.
So, and I think Germany, because of its history, has this almost automatic desire to be friendly to Israel and to be very sort of nervous about any signs of anti-Semitism in the country. However, what we're seeing, and it's part of the increasing complexities around anti-Semitism in Europe amidst the general change of demography and migration in Europe, that because we have now, according to Angela Merkel's policy, huge numbers of refugees and migrants coming in, there's also the question of anti-Semitism from outside Europe coming in, from the Arab world and the Muslim world. And there, I think, Germany is much more uneasy about confronting it than it would be from homegrown, white nationalist anti-Semitism.
Now let's talk a little bit about that, because we saw from the vote that the extreme right-wing parties and the extreme left-wing parties abstained, but there were some political maneuverings going on ahead of the vote. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, as I understand it, the AfD, which is the sort of far-right party in Germany, at least represented in the Bundestag, in the parliament, had its own vote, had its own resolution, which was more extreme against BDS. It would have banned BDS entirely, and they were saying we're the real pro-Israel party, and anti-Semitism is these days part of the left and part of the Islamist kind of influence in Europe, and that's something that we're seeing. That sort of attitude is something we're also seeing, of course, from the populist right-wing parties in Europe. Mm-hmm. Now, Germany and Western Europe, they're very nervous about that, about the rise of these populist parties, and the problem for those of us who are confronting anti-Semitism and trying to work against it is that it is coming from both places. It is coming from the left and the right. You could say, there's this idea that the political spectrum is a circle where the two ends meet. And I think in Europe, I think anti-Semitism might be one of those places where they meet.
Right. And so, yes, go ahead.
But I have to mention that most of the anti-Semitic outbursts in Eastern Europe are coming from the right and not from the left, like in Germany or Britain or France. However, it's not linked to the BDS. Even the anti-Semites in Eastern Europe are not necessarily advocating BDS. Indeed, they are sometimes even critical, and sometimes even more than that. Sometimes they are very friendly to Israel in general. Mm-hmm. They have problems with anti-Semitism, which is apparently a very inner sort of thing for them. But never the BDS. This is not an issue. It's interesting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, do you think this declaration will have any sort of impact on anti-Semitism in Europe?
I don't think it will, but I want to raise an element which hasn't been discussed, and that is the long term. And that is, in my day, when you went to university as a Jewish student, you had your own views in Israel. You probably joined the Jewish society and may be involved in what was going on. The BDS has failed economically and certainly failed miserably over the Eurovision Song Contest. But what has happened is that many people who feel a connection with Israel are alienated, considered to be colonialists, imperialists, etc. And I'm concerned not for this present generation, but for the next generation. Not that there has to have automatic support for every policy in Israel, but less and less people are Jewish people or people who are sympathetic to Israel are involved in what is going on. And that, I think, is a very serious question. And my colleague who is involved in Masa is doing very important work to try and balance this situation. But the other thing mentioned before is we also need to understand these statements in the backdrop, not that there's a Jewish vote, in the upcoming European elections. And this, certainly in Poland, and certainly in Germany and other countries, we need to see a certain perspective, as was when President Trump basically recognized Israel's position on the Golan, etc. It wasn't coincidental, it was before the election. So very often we miss the greater picture. Mm-hmm.
And so, sorry, what were you going to say?
No, I was just going to add to Ambassador Ravner's point about the anti-Semitism from the right, and the fact that some of these parties are actually also friendly, whether genuinely or not, are at least rhetorically friendly towards Israel. And it is this complication that the Israeli government has to deal with, I think, whereby countries that are very friendly towards Israel, it turns out, can also be problematic for their indigenous Jewish population, and that's something that is a new complexity.
It's a new phenomenon that we're seeing in Europe today.
I think so.
And how do you think it's going to unfold?
Well, first of all, I think we get back. I don't know. I'm a historian, and if I was a futurist, I would make more money. Mm-hmm. But I think one of the other problems is we need to see this in context. And the question we haven't discussed, and perhaps we should, is BDS anti-Semitism? The fact of the matter is Israel is perhaps the only country that is singled out. There's nothing about Tibet. There's nothing, the same lecturers who sign petitions against Israel have no problem of going to a conference in Russia, who is illegally annexed a large area. And so there's this disproportionality of attacks on only Israel is this delegitimization, irrelevant of the government or the politics. That's what's, I think, concerning and has momentum.
I remember really maybe 20 years ago that every Saturday morning there was a small group of pro-Palestinians standing in the front of the big shops of Oxford Street and with posters to boycott Israel. It was kind of bizarre and small thing which developed. Grew up, didn't grow up, but grew definitely, and became more and more of a problem. Now, indeed, this is a very encouraging act and development in Germany. But I'm wondering if we can expect the development of further such moves in political moves in other countries, because there is a problem of the freedom of speech after all. And even though definitely we are sure, and from the beginning you could notice that much of the speech against Israel is quite anti-Semitic, singling out, but even more than singling out. I do remember, and Paul certainly remembers, how difficult it was several years ago to go to university, Oxford, Cambridge, physically. They stopped you, they disturbed you.
If I could interject here, in 1975 I was head in Leeds of the Jewish students, and having in the morning gone to protect the rights of Asians to become part of the union, when we got back to the campus we were banned from meeting because we were racists. And this was something which was part and parcel of what was going on. This delegitimization of Israel through every fact. But there's another thing, is that this BDS also has an undercurrent. There are people who have boycotted Israeli students when it comes to grants, without even actually declaring it.
It's called the silent boycott.
It's a silent boycott, which is problematic.
But we shouldn't. I think we shouldn't be too pessimistic and not too optimistic. On the one hand, yes, the BDS really developed to quite a large phenomenon, certainly larger than 15 years ago. But on the other hand, it's not so bad. We did mention, it was mentioned here, the boycott, the economic boycott of the 60s and the 70s, when there were no settlements, or hardly any settlements, even after 67, hardly any. I'm quite old to remember that in the beginning of the 70s, there was only one Japanese car in Israel, Subaru. There was no Toyota, no Mazda, no Hyundai. Hyundai is Korean, okay, but also them as well. There was just only one car. The Japanese intentionally were selling only one sort of car to Israel, not to infringe the boycott, the Arab boycott.
The same in the United States. The United States, despite companies complied with the boycott.
Like Coca-Cola.
Yeah.
We didn't have Coca-Cola.
No, the opposite. We didn't have Pepsi-Cola.
Can you think of that?
Yes. Yeah.
So it's not so bad. I mean, definitely it's a danger, the BDS, but it could have been much worse. And now it's maybe it is a turning point now with this German surprising act, maybe. But again, I'm not sure that too many other countries will follow. Germany is, as mentioned here, is after all something special to Jews.
All right, last thoughts, because we have to wrap up. Go ahead.
Just to say that I think one of the problems here is not so much with Europe, but with anti-Semitism itself. Anti-Semitism itself is something very unusual. It really isn't like other prejudices in all kinds of ways. It has this capacity to manifests itself, as in its religious form, in its racial form, in its national form against the state of Israel. We see with the Labour Party in Britain, for example, that this is a test case in many ways, right? You have a new leader elected with a long history of anti-Israel activity, and lo and behold, the party becomes literally infected with anti-Semitism, and not just in its anti-Israel form, but hook-nosed caricatures, protocols, Holocaust denial. The whole thing is now part of the discourse on social media among Labour Party officials.
Great. Well, thank you, gentlemen. That's all the time we have for this segment. Thank you very much for joining us today.